This is Legislative Review on Prairie Public. I'm Dave Thompson. Thanks for joining us. Our guest this week is State Representative Kim Koppelman of West Fargo. He's a Republican, also chairs the House Judiciary Committee. Representative, thank you for being here.
You're welcome, Dave. Good to be back with you again.
You were here 2 years ago, and I wanted to ask this question. What is the workload like for your committee and maybe overall compared to 2 years ago?
You know, Dave, I can't give you an exact count. I think overall the bills, the last number I remember is somewhere around 850 bills in the session, and I believe it's slightly, perhaps slightly less than last session, but very close. In our committee, I think we actually have a few fewer bills, but I would say that the count is very, very similar. I believe we had about 70 bills or a little more than that the first half of the session last time, and we were very close to that as well this time.
So at this stage in the session, your committee is almost done with the hearings and probably kicking bills out, getting them on the floor as soon as you
Yes,
can.
in fact, we finished our bill hearings in the House Judiciary Committee this week, and we had a few Senate concurrent resolutions, which are the resolutions sometimes follow the bills because the deadlines are later and so on. And so we actually wrapped all of those hearings up this week, and now we're moving into committee work, which is where we act on all of those bills. Some of them are fairly easy to deal with, and we vote them out virtually immediately after we hear them, and others are bills that require a little more work, and they hang around for a little longer. But the fiscal note bills, the bills that carry a financial impact that's at all significant, need to be voted out by Monday. So we have, I believe, all but 3 of those already have left the committee, and I think we have 2 or 3, must be 3 more that we have to act on Monday.
And the reason they're getting out of committee by Monday is because they have to go to appropriations.
That's right. They are re-referred, and then the Appropriations Committee takes a look at the dollars and cents. And I served in the Appropriations Committee for 4 years, so I'm somewhat familiar with that process. But we have what we call policy committees in the legislature, and we have the Appropriations Committee, and it's really 2 parts of the whole. We enact policy we think is a good idea, or reject policy we think is a bad idea, and then the Appropriations Committee on the bills that we pass has to sit down and look at it and ask, can we afford it?
So I'm going to ask this question, since you were on appropriations, now
Sure.
you're chairman of a policy committee. Which one's more fun?
Policy, for me. And not everyone feels that way. There are some people that are just built for appropriations and they flourish there, they love it. I started out in the legislature as virtually all, I think I can say all legislators do. I don't think I've ever seen a freshman on appropriations. So we all start out on policy committees, and I've been here 20 years now. When I first came, I was on policy committees, in fact, the same 2 committees I serve on today, and really enjoyed it. I was vice chairman of the Judiciary Committee at that time, and the leader at that time came to me and asked me to go to appropriations. I politely declined. He sent 2 others to ask me separately. And finally I said, Mr. Leader, I'm a team player. You put me where you need me. And so I served for, as I said, 2 sessions, 4 years on appropriations, and really did enjoy it. I think everyone should have an opportunity to do that because you understand the process, the budgets, and those things a lot better once you have. But I could not wait to get back to policy, and I've been privileged to be there ever since. And I chaired the Constitutional Revision Committee before chairing the Judiciary Committee, and I've also chaired the Administrative Rules Committee as well.
Well, since you've talked about 20 years too, I've been asking everybody that I can see, as we're getting toward the latter days of the session, every session seems to have a theme or a direction. If you could put a theme or direction on this session, what do you think it is?
Well, it's very interesting. It's hard to pick a theme. I think a theme might be cautious optimism, perhaps. And when I say that, I'm primarily talking about the fiscal front, because as you know, North Dakota has been booming for the last several years with the oil boom. By the way, if I can just say parenthetically, I think, and you may want me to share the story, and I'd be happy to, but I think public policy is one of the reasons that oil has done so well in North Dakota. It's not just the research under the ground, and we can return to that if you'd like. But as the oil boom has occurred and as the state has benefited from it, I think now we're at a point where we have to take a deep breath and with the fiscal outlook say we can't afford to spend as much. As has often been said, the golden goose is laying smaller eggs, and we need to take a look at that and just be a little more fiscally responsible.
But this really wasn't unexpected either, because it is commodities go up and down.
Absolutely. And when I say the legislature was involved, I had a very interesting conversation a few years, I guess it's about 2 years ago now, with a group of oil industry executives and scientists. Was asking them about fracking and all that sort of thing. And one of the chief engineer, in fact, for one of the largest companies, largest players in the Bakken, was explaining to me more the detailed science of how fracking works. And then he stopped and he asked me a question. He said, "How long have you been in the legislature?" And I said, "Well, I was elected in 1994. He said, "Do you remember the 95 session?" I said, "Well, yeah, I remember. It was my freshman session." He said, "Do you remember what you did to the oil tax?" I said, "Yeah, I remember we tweaked it a little bit." He said, "Well, let me tell you the story." He said, "We had this idea for how we could do this, try this fracking to extract oil out of this rock, this shale rock. We didn't know if it would work. It had not been tried really anywhere the way we wanted to do it here. Fracking had been around, but not that formula, not that way of doing it." And he said, "We came to the legislature and we asked you if you would tweak your tax structure just a little bit to allow us to afford to try this, because we couldn't afford to the way your taxes were. And you said yes." And the next words out of his mouth are forever ingrained in my mind. He said, "If it were not for the fact that North Dakota has a business-friendly legislature, there would be no Bakken oil boom." And that's a fairly profound statement. So I believe that good public policy says this is a precious resource. It's one that we are guardians of to a certain degree with being the elected representatives of the people. At the same time, we need to do what we can to help business thrive and to be responsible. And I think that's, to a great extent, from the people who are involved, what's responsible for the oil boom. Now, what you just said is true. It's not unexpected because we know things ebb and flow. We know a commodity price goes up and down. And it's important to note, as our majority leader has said, that the sky is not falling. We're in good shape in North Dakota. In fact, one of the things that I think is rather interesting is there are two things that, when we get into the political realm particularly, that the minority party has criticized the legislature for in the last few years. One is the idea of hoarding money. You've got all these pots of money and you're putting money away. Well, some are constitutional, we can't touch them anyway. But to the extent that we have been responsible with the people's money and the tax dollars we collect from oil and set some of those aside for a rainy day, it's precisely because of what you talked about. These things ebb and flow, and this session would be a lot different if we didn't have some of those resources to fall back on. So I think that's very responsible. The other thing is, we need to look at the oil tax. Now is probably not the time to do it because of the volatility of the market. But last session, the Senate looked at an issue of possibly dealing with the way we tax oil in North Dakota and what we call the triggers, and whether that's good public policy or not. Now we're in the throes of that, so we're not going to, try to do that midstream. But we should look at that and say what's good for the long term as this ebbs and flows, what's best for the oil industry, for those who own mineral rights, what's best for the public and the state coffers as we go forward.
I haven't seen a study resolution specifically on that topic, but I have a feeling that this is going to be part of your 2-year interim studies.
I would be, Dave, I'd be very surprised if it's not.
Since we're talking about some of the things that have happened with the oil boom, one of the things that has happened is a little bit more of a downside thing, and that's the whole issue of human trafficking.
Yes.
And legislators from both sides of the aisle, both the House and Senate, and Republicans and Democrats have really attacked this issue. And you're part of that because your committee looks at it. You're on some of the bills
Absolutely.
to deal with human trafficking. Where are we at now in terms of getting a more comprehensive policy?
Well, Dave, I'm glad you brought that up because if you were to ask me what's been the defining issue or one of the 2 or 3 top issues that our committee has dealt with in this session, I would have to say that it is the human trafficking issue. And we have a package of bills right now in the Judiciary Committee. We've had all the hearings. We've acted on a couple of them, and we'll be acting on the others within the next week or 2. And they're all bills that deal with this tremendously troubling issue. What we're finding in North Dakota is that human traffickers around the country are targeting North Dakota. And you could argue that's because there's a market there because of the oil boom. A lot of people from a lot of places around the country are coming to North Dakota to find jobs and so on, and that's all good. But with it comes the seedier side of life. And our concern is if women are being, it's not always women, I don't mean to base it only on gender, but I would say it's fair to say the predominance of people, the predominant number of people that are caught up in this are probably women. When they're human trafficked, and we think first of prostitution, but there's other types of human trafficking. There's issues of labor human trafficking. Sometimes these people are forced to get involved in other types of crimes like forgery and theft and various things in order to obey, if you will, what their traffickers are telling them. So we've got a number of bills that deal with a lot of these ancillary issues, and I would be very surprised if they don't all pass, and probably even surprised if they don't all pass unanimously out of our committee.
So, in looking at this issue, what has been the most eye-opening for you and might be eye-opening for the people listening to this program?
Well, some of the national news programs have in recent months and years, in the last year or two, actually had some stories on this issue. I think one of the issues that maybe surprises some people is that many of the young women who are caught up, is particularly with respect to prostitution in human trafficking, are victimized in ways that we had never dreamt before. And they are, they're caught up in this because in some cases it's virtually a kidnapping that's involved, where people are just snatched and they're taken into this situation of servitude, and they're forced to do various things for the people who control them. And so I think the approach that's being taken is to say most often these people, especially the minors that are involved, are victims. They're not criminals, they're victims. Now, would I say that every prostitute is a victim? No. But I think we want to focus on the vast majority, particularly those that are minors that may be. And we want to go after the traffickers, make sure we have good tools in place to catch them, to charge them with the crimes they've committed, and to convict them. And then we want to make sure that we get the young victims into programs that'll help them and get them back into a productive life.
So you've got the safe harbor law too.
We do indeed.
And is that out of committee?
We voted that out of committee yesterday, and it was, I know this is being taped for later broadcast, we voted it out of committee Wednesday. And that was a unanimous vote out of committee. Different amendments were considered. We adopted a couple, but nothing that changes it substantively.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask. There seemed to be one bump, at least in some quarters. This what was described as the gag part of a bill. Can you explain what that was?
Yeah, in the Senate there was an amendment adopted, and this is on the probably what most would consider the major human trafficking bill. It's the bill that the Uniform Law Commission came up with, and many states are considering it. But to understand, a uniform law doesn't mean that it's the same verbatim in every state. It just means that the core, the principle of the law, the essence of what it does is the same as it goes state to state. And as that bill came to the North Dakota Senate, they attached an amendment that said that if any entity that is helping these victims of human trafficking receives money from the state, that they can't use that money to counsel for or to encourage abortion. That's been public policy in North Dakota for as long as I have been aware of it. But there was a huge reaction that I think almost bordered on hysteria that misunderstood and said this was a gag order and you're violating people's First Amendment rights, free speech rights. That wasn't the case at all. As our committee examined the amendment, all it said was that you could not use those dollars, taxpayer dollars, to tell someone or encourage someone to go get an abortion. Now, we have other programs in North Dakota that do that. We have an Alternatives to Abortion program that says if you're going to take money from the state, you can't counsel for abortion. Meaning, as an entity, as an organization, you make a decision. Either we're going to send people off to get abortions, or we're going to take tax dollars, but we're not going to do both. This amendment was far narrower. All it said was, you can do whatever you want to do outside of these parameters, but with respect to the money that you take from the state, the money that you get that is out of the pockets of the taxpayers of North Dakota, that money cannot be used to refer for abortion. So what our committee did with it is to adopt an amendment that some feel clarifies that a little more even. And we kept that on the bill because we think it's consistent with public policy.
It may be that's why the uproar seems to be dying down a bit.
I think so, and members, I know we have members on our Judiciary Committee, some are pro-life, some are pro-choice, they all voted for the bill unanimously.
And that's a good thing to point out, is that there seems to be a real, and just the bigger issue, the whole human trafficking issue, there seems to be a real commitment from state, from the legislature, from the executive branch, and the judicial branch to do something.
Absolutely, Dave. I think that's absolutely true. We work, of course, closely with our Attorney General's office on these kinds of issues, law enforcement issues, and the people there are 100% behind it. And we expect some good results as a result of what we're doing at the state legislature on that issue.
Since we talked about the judiciary, did you get a chance in your committee, or was that specifically just for the budget committee, to look at the issues of space for the Supreme Court and also the new judges?
We did look at it in general. We did not have the bills because they're in the budget, as you mentioned. And I know last session we also added judges. I believe the status right now is that new judges are are being added in various places in the state, and I think they're needed. I serve also on the Indigent Defense Commission, which is the group that provides attorneys when they can't be afforded by people that are charged with crimes. And in the western part of our state, that is a virtual epidemic. Just like human trafficking is on the increase, so is all kinds of criminal activities. In fact, one county sheriff told me, we don't even charge misdemeanors anymore. We don't have time. We go after felons. And so law enforcement is stretched, the courts are stretched, and I know the Indigent Defense Commission's budget is up because of that. The judicial branch's budget is up as well. With respect to the space issue, I have a personal opinion on that. I think it's a really good thing in North Dakota that you can go to our state capitol, you can walk down to one end of the hall and visit with legislators. You can walk a little further toward the middle of the hall and visit with people in the executive branch like the governor, the attorney general, the secretary of state, and so on. You can walk a little further down the hall and visit with the Chief Justice of the North Dakota Supreme Court if you want to. There's something about our government being close and accessible that's really good. There was a proposal, I believe, to move the Supreme Court to another building on the campus of the Capitol, which I understand their space needs. Personally, I like them there, and I think we can accommodate in other ways their needs for extra space for their staff.
It's funny you should mention that. If I can just take a brief moment to tell a story, I believe that there was an original plan to do it. It's called the Liberty Memorial Building, where the state library is. And I believe the original plan was to move the Supreme Court over there, but I think Chief Justice Erikstad fought that when they built the judicial wing of the building because he wanted everybody in the same building.
And you know, I hate to do this on television, having not spoken to him privately yet, but this is the first session in a long time that I haven't darkened the door of the Chief Justice and visited with our great Chief Justice, Jerry Vandewalle, who's a friend and has done a tremendous job for our state. But I know he advocated for that move in his State of the Judiciary address this year. Personally, unless I get a lot more compelling evidence, I don't think that's a good idea for precisely the reason that Justice Erikstad gave, which is that as I mentioned, which I think the proximity is very important. Ironically, the Chief Justice from South Dakota was here on the day our North Dakota chief gave his State of the Judiciary address, and I happened to visit with him privately. And I said, you know, a few years ago I chaired the Council of State Governments, which is all 3 branches of government in all 50 states. And my initiative, my focus when doing that was on interbranch relations, because it's the only entity that involves all 3 branches of state government. I remember visiting, I went to the Conference of Chief Justices and other places and visited with folks in the judiciary. I went to the Supreme Court in Minnesota and visited with the folks there, and they're in a separate building, they're far apart. And I remember the chief at that time telling me, I never see legislators because we're a different, not only are we a different branch of government, we're physically separated, we're in our own realm, our own world, we just don't interact. And I remember at the time thinking how easy it is for justices to come into our Judiciary Committee and testify on a bill, for me to go down the hall and visit with them as a legislator if I choose. There's something special about that. So on that day, I visited with the chief from South Dakota who was here to honor our Chief Justice who had won some special recognition. And I asked him that question. I said, what do you think? Have you heard there's a proposal to move the Supreme Court to another building? He said, I wouldn't do that. He said, in South Dakota and North Dakota, we've done it right. We have them close by, and that accessibility is really important.
I think it also mentioned, when you mentioned Minnesota, you know, that's the one thing that I think a lot of people find almost amusing is that they call legislators asked to talk to their staff. Well, legislators in North Dakota, with very few exceptions, well, you're looking at it.
That's right.
Basically.
That's right. When I was chairing Council of State Governments, people used to ask, well, from larger states, well, what is your office like? And I would say, well, I have a little desk on the House floor. I've got a center drawer, and there's 2 side drawers, and one is mine, and one belongs to the guy next to me. And they'd say, well, no, I mean your office. I said, that is my office. Well, what about you in your district? Well, that's my home or my business, you know. And what about your staff? Well, we have a common staff, the Legislative Council. Those are the attorneys and fiscal analysts who will draft legislation for us. And we have some pages that'll go get a photocopy for you. But other than that, and that's all common staff, no individual staff, we are really the people's house in North Dakota. And it's a wonderful thing because we are citizen legislators, and people from around the country, I think, are amazed by it. People in our state really appreciate it.
I would like to get to an issue because you're one of the people who had a tax bill.
Yes, I
did.
did.
Income tax reduction bill. Yours was a flat tax bill.
It was.
There's apparently one vehicle or maybe 2 out there where they're talking about $100 million in income tax relief for individuals and as the Senate amended, is 26 million for corporate.
Okay.
And there are some people who are saying that maybe the state can't afford this time. What are you hearing, and what's your opinion?
Well, my opinion, and I think the opinion of the majority in the House, is that this is the people's money. This is not our money. So we should not be talking about how much of our money we can give to the people. We're talking about how much of the people's money we're going to take or keep. And I think we always look favorably, when at all possible, at lowering taxes. And you know, Dave, it's not a zero-sum game. History proves, both on the state level and the federal level, that when taxes are lowered, you don't take in less, you take in more. And so I'm not worried, as long as we're reasonable about how we do it, I'm not worried about collecting less. What I did in my bill is I actually asked the Legislative Council and the Tax Department to prepare a vehicle for us where we could do a flat tax where there were nothing but winners, no losers, because we have a modestly graduated tax in North Dakota now. I was a co-sponsor of the bill years ago that decoupled us from the federal tax, because I think that's important. We should make tax policy in North Dakota, not allow Congress to make tax policy for us on state taxes. And so for a long time I've thought we should also go to a simple flat tax. And the bill that I proposed had no losers, only winners. Everybody, no matter where you are on the income spectrum, would have received a tax break. And unfortunately it failed, I think, mainly because of the price tag. Again, I think that's a little flawed, because when we do this historically, we take in more, not less. But we have to look at it statically. This is how many dollars, if all other things were equal, that would not come into the state. I still think that's a good idea, and most of the folks, even on the tax committee, of both parties actually, that I talked with about it, said, we like your bill the best. We just think the fiscal note might be a little high for this session.
So this might be something that we might see again in 2017.
I think that might be very possible.
Where do you think it, there's been a lot of talk about some austerity, and when we're talking about austerity, we're not talking about actually going into the meat of budgets and cutting budgets at this point. Where do you see it? Some things that have been taken out of budgets are buildings, because there's no real appetite to bond for anything right now, since state is fairly debt-free. Where do you think it might end up?
Well, I think austerity or being very careful with the taxpayers' money is always a good thing, and I think it's an extra incentive to do that when the future is uncertain, when major industry like oil, and for that matter, agriculture. I spoke the other day to one of our business leaders, runs the biggest mall in maybe in the state, certainly the biggest mall in Fargo, the other day, and I asked how things are going, and he said, we never really benefited that much from the oil boom on our end of the state, but we did benefit from the ag boom, and he said now we're feeling that. So agriculture is down, oil is down, energy is down. Those are all things that affect North Dakota. Having said all of that, I think there's not a budget out there that I've seen that's being cut. What sometimes happens is the governor, as you know, comes out with some requests, the governor's budget, they call it, early in the session. And then the legislature has to look at that, has to look at what we spent in the past, has to look at all the requests and all the needs out there and make some decisions. I think I'm reasonably confident in saying that virtually no one, maybe no one at all, will receive less money in terms of agencies and beneficiaries of government programs. It's only a question of how much additional they're going to receive.
Now the talk is maybe trying to keep about $200 million as a cushion. I think in 1995 you were talking about $5 million or something like that.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Things have changed. I mean, I remember my first legislative session, one of my former colleagues from the Senate wrote an article in his hometown newspaper lamenting the first $1 billion state agency budget, and billion with a B, and that was the Department of Human Services. I think our whole state budget was about $3.5 billion back then. So things have changed a lot. When we used to talk millions, now we're talking billions. I think a cushion or a reserve is very important this session because of the uncertainty of all those commodity prices that we've discussed.
Do you think you'll have to come back in special session? I asked that because leadership is talking about reserving at least 5 days in case.
Well, I think we should, and remember, we've not used, in the Constitution, we're allowed 80 days for a legislative session. We've not used the full 80 ever until the last session. So we always try to save some time. My first session, it was 67 days. So sometimes we've saved a lot. I think it's very important to try to reserve some days. The legislature in North Dakota can call itself into special session. The governor can also call us into special session. But I think with the uncertainty of the times we're living in, that's a possibility. I think we need to do everything we can to make it a slimmer possibility to do our work well so that every eventuality we can guess about is dealt with, and we have a responsible budget and a responsible program as we leave. If things change to the extent that we need to readjust that, we can come back.
I need a fairly short answer on
Sure.
this one because we're getting close to time.
Yes.
But this is a complicated subject.
It is.
And it could probably take a whole half hour.
Yeah.
The legacy fund is out there in
Yes.
2017. The legislature can start spending it
Yes.
if some parameters are met. Is it a possibility the legacy fund is another like rainy day fund that's out there in case you need it?
Well, I think it's there. As it was adopted, it takes a 2/3 vote of the legislature ever to get at the principle of the legislative fund, at the legacy fund rather. In an emergency, I think that could occur. I think the intent, though, is to allow, as the measure provides, that the interest or the proceeds from that fund flow into the general fund and are used, but the principal stays.
So it is a possibility.
It is.
All right. Well, thank you very much for
Thank you.
taking the time.
It's been a pleasure.
Our guest today on Legislative Review, Representative Kim Koppelman of West Fargo. He's a Republican. He chairs the House Judiciary Committee. For Prairie Public, I'm Dave Thompson.